When Cora Dutton died after 41 years as the quiet keeper of a grain mill nobody drove to anymore, her family divided what she left behind in under 3 days. The house went to her eldest. The truck went to a cousin in Springfield. The furniture got sorted on a Saturday morning while Pearl was still driving down from Kansas City. By the time Pearl arrived, the only thing left was the mill itself, a 100-year-old stone building at the bend of Crane Creek, full of dust and rusted equipment and boxes of junk nobody wanted. Harlan said Pearl could have it. He said it like he was doing her a favor. But under a sealed panel in the dumbwaiter shaft, bolted where no carpenter put it as a matter of course, was something Cora had built over 14 years. Something the whole township had eaten without knowing who had baked it. Something that had Pearl's name on it from the very start. She was 70 years old and she had driven 4 hours, and she had buried her sister 6 days ago. And she walked into the Dutton Mill on a September morning with a box of cleaning supplies and the expectation of nothing. What she found changed all of that, but not right away. Cora had been 11 months younger than Pearl. People always mixed them up, not because they looked alike, which they didn't particularly, but because they moved through the world with the same economy. Cora was quieter. Pearl talked more. But they both had the quality of taking up exactly the space they needed and not a sliver extra, and people who spent time around them felt settled rather than crowded. They had not lived near each other in 30 years. Pearl had moved to Kansas City with her husband Ray in 1991, raised 2 kids, watched Ray die of a slow cancer in 2017, and kept going the way you keep going. Cora had stayed in Ozark County. She taught school for a decade, then taken on the mill when their father could no longer manage it, then kept it going past the point when it made sense economically, past the point when the county roads were paved and the grain trucks went to the elevator in town, past the point when anyone who thought about it rationally would have sold. She had kept it because she loved it. Pearl knew that without being told. Some things about sisters you know without being told. They talked on the phone every Sunday evening. They drove to see each other at Christmas and in the summers when the kids were young. When Ray died, Cora had come up to Kansas City for 3 weeks and slept on the couch and made soup every morning and didn't offer any advice except the kind Pearl actually asked for. When Cora got sick, the same slow cancer, the same terrible timing, Pearl had tried to come down. Cora had said, "Wait, I'm fine. Come at Thanksgiving when the leaves are off the sycamores and the light is good." She hadn't made it to Thanksgiving. Pearl had driven down for the funeral in a state of something that wasn't quite grief yet, because grief requires time to settle, and she hadn't had time. She'd sat in the front pew of the Baptist church in Hartwell and listened to people describe her sister, and every description was right and none of them was complete, and she'd thought, nobody ever knows a person all the way through. The family gathering afterward had lasted 2 hours. Harlan Dutton, Cora's nephew through their brother Pete, who died in 2014, managed the sorting. He was 53, an equipment dealer in Springfield with the well-organized efficiency of a man who charged hourly and saw no reason not to apply the same approach to a family estate. He made lists. He assigned items. He was not unkind, exactly. He was thorough in a way that felt unkind. When he got to the mill, he paused. "It's worth what the land's worth," he said. "Which isn't much given the access road floods every March. The building itself needs work I can't price without a contractor in there." "I'll take it," Pearl said. Harlan looked at her. "It needs a lot of work," he said. "I know. The equipment hasn't run in years. I know. You live in Kansas City." "I know that too," Pearl said. Harlan shrugged. He added the mill to her column on his list and moved on. Pearl stayed at Mossy's kitchen table that evening. She hadn't planned to. She'd walked across the road after the others left, and Mossy had been making supper and had said, without making it into anything, that there was enough and Pearl should stay. They ate at a kitchen table that had been in the Crane family for 4 decades, under a lamp that hung low and yellow over the plates, and Mossy talked about Cora and Pearl listened, and then Pearl talked and Mossy listened, and neither of them made the conversation mean more than it did, which was the exactly right way to handle it. "Said you'd come back," Mossy said. "She didn't know I'd leave." She did, though. She said you'd have your own life to tend. She said she'd done what she could to make it easy to come back when the time was right. Mossy poured more coffee. She didn't say how she'd done it. I didn't ask. Pearl thought about the panel behind the counterweight. She hid it, Pearl said. She hid all of it where she knew I'd find it. Where'd she put it? The dumbwaiter. I used to ride in it when I was 9. Mossy shook her head slowly. That's Cora, she said. 40 years of hiding things in plain sight. Pearl drove home to Kansas City the next morning. She handled what needed handling: the apartment, the cat, the standing appointments. She called her daughter in Denver and her son in Portland and told them what she was going to do. Her daughter said, "Mom, are you sure?" Her son said, "It sounds like Aunt Cora." She took both of those as encouragement. 6 days after the funeral, she drove back down. The mill sat at the bend of Crane Creek on a clay road that had not been maintained to the standard of the county roads since the 1980s. Pearl's sedan threw a rooster tail of orange-red dust behind it, and the creek was visible through the sycamores on the left, low and clear in September, stones showing pale in the morning light. The building was 2 stories of native limestone, quarried from the bluff a quarter-mile upstream by men Pearl had never known but who were, by some account she'd read in a county history book, her father's grandfather's neighbors. The limestone was the color of old cream, pale and substantial, with dark mortar lines between the blocks. The roof was tin, patched in 3 places with newer tin that hadn't yet weathered to match. The mill wheel was still in place, but still dry. The creek had been diverted from it years ago when a beaver dam upstream changed the flow channel, and the cost of rerouting was more than the milling revenue justified. Pearl parked on the gravel apron beside the building and sat for a moment looking at it. It was bigger than she remembered from childhood. Or maybe she was smaller then and everything was bigger. She'd come here summers as a girl. Her father had managed the mill before Cora took it over, and summer meant weeks of watching grain come in by the sack and go out as flour, the stone grinding working up through the floor into her feet, the air white with fine dust that caught the light through the high windows and made the inside look like a photograph of itself. She got out of the car. The door was a plank door with a black iron latch, the kind you lift and twist. It had been left unlocked. When Pearl lifted the latch and pushed, the door swung inward on hinges that had been recently oiled. She noted that Cora had oiled those hinges not long before she died. She'd been taking care of the place up until she couldn't. Inside, the air was cool and still and smelled of stone and old flour, and something faintly sweet she couldn't name. Dust moved in the light from the east windows, motes suspended slow, the particular unhurried drift of a place that had been still for a while but hadn't been abandoned. There is a difference, you can feel it. The ground floor was one large room with the millstone assembly in the center, the stone itself 4 feet across and dark with decades of use. The wooden housing around the gearing was intact. Shelving ran the perimeter. On the shelves, mason jars of grains, their labels faded. A stack of folded flour sacks, cotton the old kind. A hand scale with brass weights in a wooden box. A clipboard with paper still on it, the top sheet a tally of something from 3 years ago. In the northwest corner, the dumbwaiter. It was a simple wooden box on a rope and pulley system, built to move sacks of grain between the ground floor and the upper level where the sorting and bagging happened. The box itself was maybe 2 feet square. The shaft it ran in was limestone, faced with tongue and groove pine boards on the inside. The counterweight was a river stone the size of a watermelon, hung on a separate rope beside the box. Pearl had forgotten about the dumbwaiter until she saw it. She and Cora had played in it as children. Pearl had fit inside the box when she was 9. She'd made Cora haul her up to the 2nd floor and lower her back down until their father found out and put a stop to it. She stood looking at it for a moment. Then she looked at the work table along the south wall. On it, arranged as if Cora had just stepped away, a coffee mug, cream-colored with a blue stripe around the rim, chipped on the handle in a triangular notch Pearl recognized from 40 years ago. Their mother's mug. Cora had carried it from house to house since their mother died in 1989. Beside it, a ball of baker's twine, the red and white kind, with a small folded note tucked into the center of the ball. The note was sealed with a piece of tape. and open on the table face down to hold its place, a seed catalog. Pages weathered and soft from handling, open to page 41. Pearl picked up the mug first. The ceramic was still faintly warm from the morning sun coming through the south window, or maybe that was her hands. She held it the way you hold something that belonged to someone who isn't there anymore, careful and useless in equal measure. She set it down. She did not open the note in the twine yet. She wasn't ready. She walked the whole building first, the upper floor with its sorting tables and the baling equipment and the windows that looked out over the creek and the sycamores, the lean-to off the north side where sacks had been stored, and where someone had more recently stacked a sleeping bag and a camp pillow and a paperback novel with a broken spine. She noted that too and said nothing about it. Then she came back to the work table. She unwound the baker's twine carefully. It was clearly meant to be unwound, the note tucked inside deliberately, and unfolded the note. Cora's handwriting, sloped and definite. Pearl, the dumbwaiter, behind the counterweight. Love, see, that was all. Pearl looked at the dumbwaiter. She walked to it. The counterweight hung on its rope in the shaft beside the box. She leaned in and looked behind it. There was a panel in the limestone facing of the shaft. Small, maybe 14 inches square, secured with 2 wing nuts that had been painted over and then cleaned, the paint removed recently by the look of the bare metal. She reached in and turned both wing nuts. The panel came away. Behind it, a shallow cavity in the limestone, dry, cold, the kind of cold that belongs to stone that doesn't change with the season. Inside, a manila envelope, fat, sealed with clear tape all the way around. A tin box, the kind that held shortbread once, closed with a rubber band. And a flat envelope, letter-sized, with Pearl's name written on it in the same slope and determination of Cora's hand. Pearl sat on the 3-legged stool by the work table and opened the tin box first. Inside was a folded document. She unfolded it carefully. 3 pages, stapled, with a county seal on the first page. A deed. She read it slowly twice. The Dutton Mill property, 2.4 acres including the limestone building, the millrace channel and the access road to County Road 7, had been transferred by warranty deed from Cora Eugenia Dutton to Pearl Ann Dutton 14 months ago. The transfer was signed, notarized, witnessed, and recorded with the Ozark County Recorder of Deeds on October 14th of the previous year. Cora had given her the mill, not in the will, before the sickness had its final say. 14 months ago, when Cora was still driving and baking and oiling door hinges and tucking notes into balls of baker's twine, she'd signed the deed and filed it and said nothing. Pearl sat with the deed in her hands and looked at the morning light moving across the millstone. Her sister had known. She'd known the way sick people know, not always clearly and not always in time, but with the particular knowledge that comes from paying attention to your own body and your own life, and understanding that the arithmetic doesn't always come out even. She'd wanted Pearl to have the mill. She'd made it happen while she still had the authority to make it happen. And she'd hidden the proof under a panel in the dumbwaiter shaft because Pearl thought she knew why. Reading the note again, she hadn't wanted anyone to talk her out of it. She opened the fat manila envelope next. Inside was a book, not a printed book, a handmade one. A composition notebook with a stiff cover, its pages filled on both sides in Cora's handwriting, each entry dated and brief. Pearl turned to the first page. September 12th. Made a sourdough for the Pell family on Route 3. Dottie just had her third and the church ladies are spread thin. Left it on the porch, knocked and left. They have enough people coming through the front door. September 19th. Rye loaf for old Gerald at the co-op. He never asks for anything and that's how you know. October 3rd. 2 loaves of whole wheat. Mossy Crane's granddaughter is visiting from St. Louis and she mentioned the girl hadn't been eating well. Left them with Mossy. Told her they were from the oven. Page after page. Entry after entry. 14 years of baking, recorded in Cora's neat slope, each loaf named for the person it went to, each entry brief and specific. She baked bread for people. She had been baking bread for people for 14 years and she had kept the record, not to keep score but because Pearl read the entries and felt this without having to be told, because it mattered that it happened and she wanted someone to know. Pearl found the entry about Harlan on page 47. March 2020. Harlan called. Sandra left him. I didn't know things had gotten that bad between them. He didn't cry on the phone, but he was close. Baked him a sourdough that evening and drove it over. He looked terrible. Left the bread and a jar of soup and told him I'd be back Thursday. She turned pages. April 2nd. Harlan again, he's eating, that's something. April 9th. Thursday bread. He was outside when I pulled in. He said he didn't need checking on. I said I know, but I made too much bread and he should take it. He did. The entries continued every week for 2 years, every Thursday. Bread for Harlan, who had been left by his wife and who said he didn't need checking on and who took the bread every time. The last entry for Harlan was in March 2022. He seems better. Back to work full time. I think he'll be all right. I'll keep bringing bread on Thursdays, but I'll stop writing it down. Some things you just do. Pearl closed the book. She sat very still with it on her knees for a long time. Outside, the creek ran over its stones, and a crow called twice from the sycamores, and the mill sat around her, quiet and solid and full of her sister's presence. She picked up the letter with her name on it. Pearl, I'm writing this in October. The light is coming sideways through the south window the way it does in fall, and it's making everything look like it matters more than it usually does, which is maybe the October light's whole job. I want to tell you about the mill. I want to tell you what it's for. It isn't for milling grain. It hasn't been for that in 20 years. What it's for is being here. Being the place at the bend of the creek that has the lights on when you drive by. Being the place where I bake on Tuesdays and Thursdays and leave things on people's porches. Being the place where the co-op men sit on the step in the afternoon and talk about nothing important, which is the most important thing there is to talk about. Some places do their work by existing. You don't close those places. You don't let them go to someone who will tear them down or let them rot. You find the person who will understand what they're for. I found you. The deed is in the tin box. It's been recorded at the county. It's yours already, has been for over a year. I just didn't tell you yet because I wanted to be sure you were ready, and I couldn't figure out how to know that without telling you, which is a problem I've been working on. The recipe book is yours too. Read the whole thing before you do anything. The people in it are the reason the mill matters. You'll understand when you see their names. One more thing. There's a boy named Theo who has been sleeping in the lean-to. He's 16 and I know about him, and I've been leaving bread on the lean to step on Tuesday evenings. He thinks nobody knows. Please don't tell him you know. Just keep leaving the bread. I love you more than I know how to say in a letter that doesn't go on for pages. Cora Pearl folded the letter back into its envelope. She held it against her chest with both hands, the way you hold something you're not ready to set down. Outside, September was doing what September does in the Ozarks, giving you one more good day before the cold comes, warm in the sun and cool in the shade, the persimmons along the creek road going orange in the tree lines. She was 70 years old. She was going to need a lot of flour. She was also going to need somewhere to sleep, which she had not fully worked out yet. The mill had no bedroom. The upper floor had sorting tables. The lean-to off the north side had a sleeping bag that was not hers. She drove to the motel in Hartwell and paid for 3 nights, which felt like a commitment and also like the beginning of something she hadn't named yet. That night she called her daughter in Denver. Her daughter said, "Mom, are you sure this is a good idea?" Pearl said, "No." Her daughter said, "Do you want me to come down?" Pearl said, "Not yet, give me a week." You always say give me a week. It's always been right so far. Her daughter made a sound that was part exasperation and part admiration, which was the sound Pearl associated most with parenting adult children. "Call me Thursday," her daughter said. Pearl called her Thursday. She told her about the deed and the recipe book. Her daughter was quiet for a long time. "She gave you the mill 14 months ago," her daughter said finally. "She planned this." "She planned everything," Pearl said. "She just didn't tell anyone." Another quiet. "That sounds like Aunt Cora." "It does." "Are you going to stay?" Pearl looked out the motel window at the grain elevator visible down the road, at the clay-red dust on the shoulder of Route 7, at the sycamores along the creek turning orange in the distance. "I'm already staying," she said. "I just haven't finished moving in yet." She was going to need a lot of flour. She did not leave that day. That night she drove to the motel and lay on top of the bedspread with her shoes on and read the recipe book from the beginning. She read slowly, the way you read something that deserves to be read slowly. Cora's handwriting was familiar and strange at the same time. 40 years of Sunday phone calls had given Pearl the sound of her sister's voice so precisely that she could hear it in every line. The economy of the entries, 2 loaves, whole wheat, left on the step, knocked and left, was exactly Cora's way of speaking. She said what mattered and nothing else. By the time Pearl reached page 30, she was crying. Not dramatically. Just the steady, quiet kind that comes when you understand something about a person you love that you should have known earlier and couldn't have. She'd thought she knew Cora. She'd known her completely and she'd known her only partially, and both of those things were true at the same time, which was one of the things that was true about people. By page 40, she'd stopped crying and was just reading. By the end, she put the book on the bedside table and looked at the ceiling. Cora had been baking bread for people for 14 years. She'd been teaching school first, and then she'd retired and the milling was gone and the building was there, and she'd decided. Pearl could see the decision in the first entries, the tentative ones, the ones that said I left it on the step as if she wasn't sure yet if this was something she was going to do. She decided that the mill could be what it was without being a mill, that it could be the place where the bread came from, that it could keep the lights on. Pearl fell asleep with the book on the nightstand and slept better than she had since Cora died, which she attributed to the clay road dust in the air and the sound of the creek from somewhere beyond the motel parking lot. In the morning, she drove back to the mill. She did not leave that day. She had planned to assess the building and drive back to Kansas City and figure out logistics. That had been the plan. Instead, she sat with the deed and the recipe book and the letter until mid-morning, and then she drove 2 miles to the hardware store in Hartwell and bought a broom and a mop and a box of trash bags and a can of WD-40 for the equipment that needed it, and she came back and cleaned. She swept the ground floor first, pushing decades of flour dust and mouse droppings and dry leaves out the front door in long, deliberate strokes. The millstone emerged from the gray dust pale and significant, the grooves in its face still sharp. She wiped down the shelving and the work table. She oiled the dumbwaiter mechanism, which turned smoothly once the old grease was cleared away. She found the electric panel in the back corner. Cora had run electricity to the building in 2003. Pearl remembered and reset the breakers. The lights came on. Simple overhead fixtures, fluorescent, buzzing softly before they warmed to steady. At noon, she drove to the co-op across the road. Mossy Crane was 78 and ran the Crane Creek Farm Co-op from a building that had served, over the decades, as a grain elevator, a seed store, a post-collection point, and most currently a combination farm supply and informal community gathering place. She was a small woman, bird-like in the specific way of women who have worked outdoors for 50 years, with white hair cut short and eyes that didn't miss much. She was behind the counter when Pearl came in. She looked at Pearl for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "You look just like her, around the eyes." "Everyone says that," Pearl said. "It's true." Mossy came around the counter. "I'm so sorry about Cora. She was my closest neighbor and my dearest acquaintance for 30-some years. I've been trying to figure out how to be in the world without her, and I haven't done it yet." Pearl sat in the chair Mossy pointed her toward. "Tell me about the mill," Pearl said. Mossy sat on the edge of her counter stool and folded her hands. "Cora kept it going after your father couldn't," Mossy said. "Not for the milling that had mostly ended by the time she took over. She kept it for the place it was, the building." She looked at the window through which the mill was visible across the road. "There's a kind of place that a community needs even when it can't explain why. A center of gravity, something to drive past and feel the weight of." She looked at Pearl. Cora understood that. She never tried to explain it, she just kept the lights on. "Did you know about the baking?" Mossy smiled, a slow one. "I knew where the bread came from. I never said so. She'd have stopped if she thought I knew." "She kept a record," Pearl said. "A whole book." Mossy was quiet for a moment. "She would. 14 years. Of course." Mossy looked at Pearl. "That's who she was. She thought what you did for people deserved to be written down somewhere, even if nobody ever read it." Pearl thought about the recipe book on the work table, about page 47. "Did you know about Harlan?" she asked. "She baked for him every Thursday for 2 years," Mossy said. "I knew." "He's claiming she owed him money, an old loan." Mossy looked at her steadily. Whatever Cora owed Harlan, she said, was paid in bread, 100 times over, and he knows it. On the third day of Pearl's stay, when she had cleared the ground floor and opened the upper floor windows and begun to understand the building's bones, Mossy came across the road with two other women from the township. Before they arrived, Pearl had a conversation with Mossy that she would come back to for a long time. She had gone to the co-op to ask about the dumbwaiter, specifically, whether Mossy knew if there was anyone in the county who worked on old machinery like that. She'd found Mossy at the counter sorting seed orders, and the conversation had started there and gone to other places the way conversations do when both people have something they've been meaning to say. She talked about you, Mossy said. Pearl was surprised. What did she say? That you were the practical one. Mossy smiled. She meant it as a compliment. She said when things fell apart, Pearl figured out what to do next. She said she'd watched you do it your whole life. She looked at Pearl. When Ray died. When the kids left home, when your mother got sick, she said you always just found the next thing. Pearl thought about that. She was the same way, Pearl said. She was, Mossy agreed. But she never gave herself credit for it. She thought what she did was simple, that anyone would do it. Anyone wouldn't. No, Mossy said, they don't. She put down the seed order she was sorting. That's the whole story, isn't it? Anyone could bake bread. Anyone could leave it on a porch. Anyone could write down what they did in a recipe book and hide it in a dumbwaiter shaft for their sister to find after they were gone. She looked at Pearl. But only Cora did. Pearl didn't say anything. The mill knows who it belongs to, Mossy said. She said it like she was repeating something she'd heard before. Pearl recognized the phrase from the last recipe book entry. She told you that. She told me a lot of things in those last months, Mossy said. Most of them practical. She wanted to make sure the co-op account was squared before she went. She wanted to make sure the grain elevator knew where the access key was. She wanted to make sure the lean-to boy had enough for winter. She picked up the seed order again. She didn't worry about herself. She worried about the logistics. Pearl looked out the co-op window at the mill across the road. That's who she was, she said. It is, Mossy said. I hope you know it about yourself too. Pearl didn't know what to say to that. She said she'd be back later with a list of things she needed from the hardware section, and she walked back across the road and went to work. On the third day of Pearl's stay, when she had cleared the ground floor and opened the upper floor windows and begun to understand the building's bones, Mossy came across the road with two other women from the township. Dorothy Hess, 66, whose family had farmed the bottom land along the creek for 3 generations and who brought a truck full of cleaning supplies and her own mop. And June Pell, 51, whose mother was the Dottie in the recipe book, September 12th, just had her third and who had driven 20 minutes from her own farm to help because her mother had told her to. They didn't ask what needed doing. They looked and they started. Dorothy scrubbed the upper floor while Pearl organized the tools and equipment. June washed the windows inside and out, leaning out the upper sashes without apparent concern for the drop. Mossy sat on the stool by the worktable and told Pearl everything she needed to know about the county, the neighbors, the history of the mill, and the people in the recipe book. Not every name, just the ones Pearl asked about. The Pell family on Route 3, who had 4 kids now and were doing well. Old Gerald at the co-op, who had been dead 2 years but whose wife still drove by the mill on Thursdays as if expecting to see Cora's car. The family in the third entry, whose name Pearl hadn't recognized, turned out to be a family from Iowa who'd been flooded out and had rented the Hess bottom land for a season. Cora never met them in person, Mossy said. She found out from Dorothy they were there, and she started leaving bread. Pearl stood at the upper floor window and looked out at the creek and the sycamores. She had lived beside her sister for the first 20 years of her life and then parallel to her for 50 more, and she had known her well and loved her completely. She hadn't known half of it. That was not a failure. She understood that. Some people keep their best work private not out of secrecy, but out of a belief that naming it makes it smaller. Cora had kept 14 years of bread in a recipe book that she'd sealed in a dumbwaiter shaft behind a panel with wing nuts, and she'd written one note on a folded piece of paper tucked inside a ball of baker's twine. The dumbwaiter, behind the counterweight. Love, see, that was Cora. That was the whole of her in 13 words. On the 4th day, Pearl drove back to Kansas City. She had what she needed to understand what she was going back to pack. That same week, a letter arrived at the mill. Pearl didn't see it for 8 days because she was in Kansas City. When she came back down, for good this time, her sedan carrying what fit and the rest arranged for storage, the letter was on the floor inside the door. She picked it up. Hartwell return address. A law firm. She opened it at the work table with Cora's mug full of the first coffee she'd made in the mill on a portable 2-burner she'd brought from the apartment. The letter was from an attorney named Culp, representing Harlan Dutton. Harlan was claiming that Cora had, in conversation, agreed to give him first right of purchase on the mill property. He was presenting a handwritten document, a lease agreement, the letter said, signed by Cora, that established his right to acquire the property at assessed value should Cora no longer wish to retain it. The assessed value of the mill, Pearl knew from the county records, was $31,000. The letter gave her 30 days to respond. Pearl read it twice. She sat with it for a while in the way she'd learned to sit with difficult things, not avoiding them, not rushing them, just letting them be present while she thought. Then she called her daughter. After that she called Mossy. "I need a lawyer," Pearl said, "someone who knows this county." Mossy was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "There's a woman in Hartwell," she said, "retired from practice 4 years ago. Her name is Arlene Fitch. She represented half the farms in this county for 30 years. She doesn't take cases anymore, but she consults." A pause. "She's also in the recipe book." Pearl closed her eyes for a moment. "Page?" she asked. "Somewhere in the middle. Her mother had a hard year in 2014. Your sister left bread on her porch every Tuesday for 6 weeks. The mid-story setback came on a Thursday." Pearl had retained Arlene Fitch on a consulting basis, and Arlene had reviewed the deed and the recording and confirmed what Pearl already believed. The mill had been transferred to Pearl 14 months ago, legally and completely. Harlan's lease document would need to be proven genuine and would need to predate the transfer to have any validity. But on Thursday morning, Arlene called. "The signature on the lease agreement," she said. "My contact at the county recorder's office compared it to Cora's recorded signatures. There are similarities." Pearl stood very still. Meaning I can't dismiss it outright without a forensic handwriting analysis. If the signature is authentic, we have a more complicated situation." Arlene's voice was precise, unhurried. "It's also possible the document is a forgery, or that it was signed by Cora under a misrepresentation of what it was. We need to find out which." Pearl sat down on the stool. She thought about Harlan at the estate division. His efficiency. The way he'd assigned items to columns on his list without sentiment and moved quickly to the next. He had handed her the mill without argument, which she'd taken for indifference. She understood now that it had not been indifference. He'd been confident. He'd believed he had a document that gave him first right of purchase. He'd let Pearl take the property because he expected to buy it back from her at assessed value, $31,000 for a building and 2.5 acres, before she got too attached. He'd miscalculated one thing. He hadn't known about the deed. He hadn't known because Cora hadn't told anyone, and Cora hadn't told anyone because she'd known Harlan well enough to know that if the family understood the mill was already Pearl's, he would have found a way to challenge it before Cora was in the ground. Cora had protected the transaction by keeping it invisible. She had filed a deed in a county recorder's office and sealed the proof in a dumbwaiter shaft and written one note on a piece of paper tucked inside a ball of baker's twine, and she had trusted that Pearl would find it. Pearl had found it. She picked up the phone and called her daughter. Her daughter listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was not her natural instinct but which she had learned over the years was sometimes required. When Pearl finished, her daughter said, "He forged her signature." "That's what Arlene thinks. He forged a dead woman's signature on a lease agreement to steal a building from a 70-year-old woman. That's the shape of it." A pause. "What are you going to do?" Pearl looked at the recipe book on the shelf, at page 47. "I'm going to fight it," she said, "and I'm going to win." Her daughter made the sound again, part exasperation, part admiration. "Call me after Arlene's meeting," she said. Pearl sat down on the stool. She thought about Harlan. His efficiency at the estate division, his lists, The way he'd handed her the mill without argument, as if he'd known something she didn't. He had a copy made, she said. That's my read, Arlene said. But red isn't proof. I need you to find me something in Cora's own record. A note, a diary entry, anything from around the time this alleged agreement would have been made. Do you have access to her personal papers? Pearl looked at the recipe book on the shelf. She looked at the dumbwaiter. I have something, she said. Let me look. She spent that afternoon reading the recipe book from the beginning, not for the baking, for dates and context, for any entry that mentioned Harlan in connection with the mill. She found it on page 53, January. Harlan came by the mill with papers, said he wanted to protect his interest in the property. I told him he didn't have an interest in the property. He said there was family precedent. I told him family precedent wasn't a legal instrument. He left the papers. I put them in the stove. Pearl read the entry 3 times. She photographed it. She called Arlene. She documented it, Arlene said. She burned his papers and she wrote it down. She wrote everything down, Pearl said. Good, Arlene said, because I'm going to need that book. Keep the coffee on. Pearl's story goes further than you think. If you're still here, a subscribe helps more of these get made. The reckoning came on a Tuesday, 5 weeks after Harlan's letter arrived. Pearl drove to the Ozark County Courthouse in Hartwell with Arlene beside her and the recipe book in a canvas bag on the back seat. Mossy came in her own truck. June Pell came. Dorothy Hess drove down from the farm. 3 other people Pearl had met in the previous weeks: Gerald's wife, who was still driving by the mill on Thursdays and had started parking and coming in. A man named Bud who'd been in the recipe book 6 times for reasons of his own, and a younger woman named Sonia who'd grown up one road over from the mill and had eaten Cora's bread at school functions for a decade without knowing where it came from. They sat in the gallery of a county hearing room that seated 40. Harlan was at the respondent's table with his attorney. He had come alone, which told Pearl something. No family, no friends from the county. He had driven from Springfield by himself with his attorney and his forged lease agreement. He looked older than she remembered from the estate division. The night before the hearing, Pearl sat at the work table and read the recipe book from the first page to the last. She wasn't looking for anything. She knew what was in it. She had read it 4 times now. She read it the way you reread something that matters, not for new information, but for the steadiness of it, for the reminder of what kind of thing you were dealing with. A woman who baked bread and wrote it down. A woman who kept going for 14 years, entry by entry, without recognition and without complaint, because she had decided this was what a life looked like when you lived it right. Pearl closed the book and set it on the table. She looked at the chipped mug, the seed catalog, the ball of baker's twine. She thought about what she would say if anyone asked her after tomorrow what she had been fighting for. Not the building, not the deed, the record. The 48 pages of careful slope and determination that said, someone was here and they did good and it deserved to be written down. She was going to make sure it stayed where it belonged. In the morning she drove to Hartwell with the recipe book in a canvas bag on the back seat. Arlene presented first. She laid out the deed, recorded, witnessed, 14 months prior, Pearl's name on every line. She showed the chain of title. She presented the county recorder's timestamp. Harlan's attorney presented the lease agreement. He argued that even if the deed transfer was valid, the lease agreement established a prior contractual claim. The judge reviewed both documents. Then Arlene presented the recipe book. She read the January entry aloud. Harlan came by the mill with papers. Said he wanted to protect his interest in the property. I told him he didn't have an interest in the property. He said there was family precedent. I told him family precedent wasn't a legal instrument. He left the papers. I put them in the stove. The hearing room was very quiet. This is a contemporaneous record, Arlene said, written in the same hand as every other entry in this book, dated 3 weeks before the alleged lease agreement. Ms. Dutton documented that she rejected a document from the claimant and destroyed it. The lease agreement presented today is either a duplicate of that document, which she explicitly rejected and burned, or it was created after the fact. The judge looked at Harlan. Harlan's attorney leaned toward him and murmured something. Harlan sat very still. Furthermore, Arlene said, we have requested a forensic analysis of the signature on the lease agreement. The results received yesterday afternoon indicate a significant probability of non-authenticity. I'd like to enter that report now. She handed the document to the clerk. Harlan's attorney asked for a continuance. The judge denied it. He reviewed the forensic report. He looked at the deed. He looked at the recipe book entry. The deed is valid and predates any claim, he said. The lease agreement presented by the claimant is contradicted by contemporaneous documentation and flagged by forensic analysis. The claimant's case is dismissed. He looked at Harlan's attorney. I'm also referring the forensic report to the county prosecutor's office. He closed his folder. The gallery was quiet until they were outside. Bud said something under his breath that Pearl didn't catch, but that made June put her hand over her mouth to hide a smile. Ella stood with her hands clasped and her eyes bright. Mossy put her hand on Pearl's arm and didn't say anything, which was the right thing. Pearl stood on the courthouse steps and felt the September sun on her face and breathed. She had been holding, she realized, a particular tightness since the letter from Culp's office had arrived. Not fear exactly, more the held-in quality of someone carrying something that doesn't belong to them, waiting to put it down. She put it down now. She thought about Cora filing the deed 14 months ago, driving to the county recorder's office in Hartwell with the signed transfer documents, handing them to the clerk, getting the time-stamped copy back, driving home. Not telling anyone, not because she was secretive, because she was thorough. She'd wanted to make sure the thing was done before anyone could stop it. She'd driven home and put the deed in a tin box and the tin box in a cavity behind a panel in the dumbwaiter shaft, and then she'd gone home and made bread and written it in the recipe book, and none of that was dramatic and all of it was right. The gallery was quiet until they were outside. On the courthouse steps in the September sun, Mossy put her hand on Pearl's arm and didn't say anything, which was the right thing. Pearl looked at the square. A feed store. A diner with a hand-painted sign. 2 old trucks parked nose into the curb. She documented it, Pearl said. She documented everything, Mossy said. Pearl thought about the recipe book in the canvas bag. About 14 years of bread, entry by entry, each loaf named for the person it went to. About the entry for Harlan, 2 years of Thursdays, the man who said he didn't need checking on, who took the bread every time. She thought about what Cora had written about him at the end, some things you just do. She had baked for him for 2 years and then she had burned his papers and written it down and hidden the proof in a dumbwaiter shaft, and she had loved him enough to do both of those things. That was the whole of it. Harlan was on the courthouse steps. His attorney had gone to bring the car around. He stood alone on the bottom step in a charcoal jacket, not looking at anyone. Pearl walked over. He looked at her. He had the face of a man who had made a calculation and found out afterward that the numbers were wrong. She baked you bread every Thursday for 2 years, Pearl said quietly. He looked at the ground. I know. She wrote it down, every loaf. She wrote your name every week. He pressed his jaw tight. I was in a bad place, he said, after Sandra. She knew that. She came anyway. I told myself she owed me the money from years ago. She didn't owe you anything, Harlan. I know that, he said. His voice was low and precise, the voice of someone saying a thing they've been knowing for a while. I knew it before today. Pearl looked at him. She thought about what Cora had written in the letter. She hadn't addressed Harlan directly, but she'd told Pearl to read the whole book before she did anything. She'd meant for Pearl to find those Thursday entries. She'd meant for Pearl to understand that Harlan's greed was the greed of a man who had once been genuinely cared for and couldn't square that with his own behavior. She didn't want me to punish you, Pearl said. He looked up. She wanted you to understand what she gave you, Pearl said. That's all. She paused. The prosecutor will do what the prosecutor does. I can't speak to that, but I'm not going to make it worse. Harlan said nothing for a long moment. Then, she was the only person who showed up. After Sandra left, my kids called, people from the office called. But Cora she showed up on Thursday with bread and she didn't make it into anything. That was who she was, Pearl said. He nodded. She left him on the step and walked back to Mossy and June and the others. Mossy was standing with her arms folded, watching Harlan's back as his attorney's car pulled up. What did you say to him? She asked. That Cora didn't want me to punish him. Mossy thought about this. She didn't, Mossy agreed. She kept baking him bread for 2 years after he loaned her that money. She didn't keep a ledger entry about the loan, but she kept 52 Thursday entries about the bread. Pearl watched Harlan get into the attorney's car. She was never keeping score. No, she wasn't. He was. People do that, Mossy said. When they feel overlooked, they start counting. Pearl looked at her. You think he felt overlooked? Mossy was quiet for a moment. I think Harlan Dutton spent his whole adult life being competent and organized and efficient, and he never once felt like anybody saw it. His wife left. His kids moved far away. He drove down to the estate division from Springfield and ran the whole thing with his lists and his columns, and nobody thanked him. She paused. And the one person who actually showed up for him, who brought him bread every Thursday and didn't make it into anything, was the person he chose to cheat. Pearl thought about the recipe book, about what Cora had written at the end of Harlan's last entry, Some Things You Just Do. She had done Thursday for Harlan for 2 years. He had responded by forging her name on a piece of paper. She forgave him before it happened, Pearl said. Mossy looked at her. That's what the bread was, Pearl said. She knew who he was. She showed up anyway. Mossy was quiet. Your sister, she said finally, was a better person than most. She really was, Pearl said. They walked back to the others, and Bud said someone should get lunch, and June said she knew a place, and they all went. She left him on the step and walked back to Mossy and June and the others. The boy's name was Theo, 16. No family situation she could piece together entirely, but enough. He'd been sleeping in the lean-to for 6 weeks before Cora died, and he'd been there when Pearl arrived, and he'd been careful and quiet and had left no mark except the sleeping bag and the paperback novel and a balled-up granola bar wrapper in the corner. Pearl had known he was there from the first morning. She'd seen the sleeping bag through the lean-to's cracked door, and then she'd seen it covered with a fresh cloth flour sack that hadn't been there the day before, and she'd understood 2 things simultaneously: that the boy knew she was in the building, and that Cora had known about him and had not turned him out. She had read the letter again. There's a boy named Theo who has been sleeping in the lean-to. He's 16, and I know about him, and I've been leaving bread on the lean-to step on Tuesday evenings. He thinks nobody knows. Please don't tell him you know. Just keep leaving the bread. She'd bought bread at the Hartwell grocery for the first Tuesday because she hadn't started baking yet. She'd left it on the step at dusk with a cloth over it, the way the letter described. The next morning it was gone, and the cloth was folded neatly on the step, which told her something about the boy. The week after that she'd baked her first loaf in the portable oven she'd brought from Kansas City. It was not as good as Cora's. She'd tried the sourdough recipe from the first page of the book, and it had come out dense and slightly sour on the wrong end of sour. She'd left it anyway. The cloth was folded neatly on the step the next morning. The week after that the bread was better. She'd called her daughter, who had baked sourdough during the pandemic and understood the ratios, and they'd talked through it on the phone while Pearl measured and mixed at the mill's work table. She left that loaf on the step, and the next morning the cloth was folded, and beside it, placed with care, was a flat piece of limestone from the creek, smooth and gray-white, with a single word scratched into it with something sharp. Thanks. Pearl had held the stone for a long time. She'd set it on the worktable beside Cora's mug and the seed catalog. The boy's name was Theo. Pearl had known he was there since the first day. She'd been leaving bread on the lean-to step on Tuesday evenings, the way the letter said. Loaf under a cloth. She never knocked. She never said anything. On a Thursday morning in October, 6 weeks after the hearing, she was in the upper floor moving a sorting table when she heard footsteps on the stairs. She turned. Theo was standing at the top of the stairs with his hands in his pockets and the expression of someone who has decided to do something they've been putting off. I know you know, he said. I know, Pearl said. He looked at the mill, at the equipment, at the windows over the creek. I've been fixing the wheel, he said. The mill race diversion. I've been working on it in the mornings when you're not here. Pearl had noticed the work. New timber in the diversion gate. Cleared channel. She'd assumed it was someone Mossy had sent. Can I see? She said. They went down to the creek bank together, and he showed her what he'd done: 3 weeks of early morning work, teaching himself from a YouTube video, and 2 trips to the library in Hartwell for a book on mill writing. The diversion gate now sat in a channel he'd recut to the original mill race bed. All it needed was water routed back through it. Pearl stood looking at it for a long time. "The flour sacks on the third shelf," she said. "They're yours, take what you need." He looked at her. "And the Tuesday bread," she said. "That keeps coming. Cora made that arrangement and I'm keeping it." He swallowed. "What do you need?" she asked. "Not in the way of charity." In the way of a woman who had read a recipe book with 47 pages of exactly this kind of need and had some understanding of how to meet it. He told her. It was not very much. It was also quite a lot, the way the needs of 16-year-olds usually are practical and enormous and possible. She could make it work. Before then, there was October and November. October was the month Pearl moved in properly. She bought a cot for the upper floor and then, after 2 weeks of hauling herself up the narrow stairs, arranged with a man from the church in Hartwell to build a small room in the northwest corner of the ground floor. Not large, big enough for a bed and a dresser and a lamp. The limestone walls were cold and she hung quilts and it was good. November was the month she started baking for people. She was not confident. She had never been a baker in the way Cora was a baker, consistently and from intuition, and with the kind of ease that comes from having done a thing 10,000 times. Pearl baked from the recipe book, following Cora's annotated instructions, and she made mistakes and she corrected them and she made different mistakes and she corrected those too. She left a loaf on Ella's step. She left a loaf with Mossy. She drove out to the Pell farm on Route 3 and left a loaf with June for her mother Dottie, who was 81 now and who, June said, cried when she saw the bread. She didn't advertise what she was doing. She didn't announce it. She left the bread and she left, but she wrote it down. She had bought a new composition notebook. Blue cover, unlike Cora's green one. She wrote the date at the top of the first entry and then she stopped because she didn't know how to begin, and she sat for a long time at the work table with the pen in her hand. Then she wrote what was true: November, first real loaf. Sourdough better than last month. Left it with Mossy. She tasted it at the door and said, "Good." Mossy doesn't say more than she means. She wrote the second entry the following Thursday. By December, the notebook had 11 entries. By February, it had 23. 3 months later in December, the mill wheel turned for the first time in 19 years. Theo had finished the diversion gate in October. The County Water Authority had been persuaded by Mossy and Arlene together to allow the mill race restoration, which turned out to require less permission than they'd expected because the channel was an original county waterway, not a modification. By November, the water was running through. The wheel itself needed work that Pearl couldn't do alone, and that Theo couldn't do alone. But Mossy knew a man named Roy who had restored 2 other mill wheels in the county over the past decade, and who owed Cora a debt recorded on page 22 of the recipe book, Roy Dunbar. 12 loaves over 2 months. Wife's chemo. He never asked, so I never stopped, and who arrived on a Saturday in November with tools and his 2 teenage sons and worked 3 weekends straight. The wheel turned on a cold December morning. Pearl stood on the creek bank with Mossy and Theo and Roy and Dorothy and June and Gerald's wife, whose name was Ella, and a dozen others who had come because word had gotten around that something was going to happen at the Dutton Mill, and people in Ozark County, it turned out, still came to see things happen at the Dutton Mill. The water came through the gate. The wheel caught it. The paddles turned. Slowly, then finding their rhythm, the great wheel moved around on its axle for the first time in 19 years. The sound of it was something. It was a particular mechanical sound, wood and water and the groan of the gearing engaging somewhere in the building's bones, and it went through the floor of the mill and up through the walls, and Pearl felt it standing outside on the bank. She had felt it before. As a girl. The grinding working up through her feet. Theo put his hand on the building's limestone wall and felt it too. Pearl watched his face. She thought about Cora baking bread in the dark on Tuesday mornings. She thought about the recipe book. She thought about the first entry, September 12th. Sourdough for the Pell family on Route 3, and the last entry she'd found, written 3 weeks before Cora died, Tuesday. Pearl doesn't know yet what I've done. She'll be fine. She always figures things out once she decides to. The mill knows who it belongs to. Pearl had cried when she read that. She was not going to cry now. There were people watching and the wheel was turning, and this was a day for something other than grief. She put her hand on the wall beside Theo's. The vibration came up through the stone, through her palm, through her arm, steady and old and still going. The recipe book lived on the shelf beside Cora's chipped coffee mug and the seed catalog, still open to page 41, a page Pearl had finally looked at properly and found marked. Varieties for a short season, fast growing, good for giving away. Pearl had started adding entries. Not baking, at least not yet, though she was learning. Her entries were different from Cora's, less bread, more other things. Firewood left on a porch on County Road 7. A bag of winter squash from the co-op garden that Mossy grew and Pearl distributed. An afternoon helping Ella sort Gerald's tools in his workshop, which Ella couldn't bear to do alone. Small things. She wrote them in her own handwriting, which looked nothing like Cora's, rounder, less certain in its slope, the kind of handwriting that learned to be itself in its own time. Theo was living properly in the lean-to now, which Pearl had insulated with rigid foam and a second-hand space heater, and which Theo had organized with the precise instincts of someone who'd been managing small spaces for years. He was enrolled in the Hartwell High School and had told Pearl, one afternoon while they were working in the upper floor, that he was interested in mechanical engineering. She'd looked at the millstone. "Good place to start," she said. Mossy came by on Saturdays, usually with someone from the co-op in tow, and they drank coffee on the limestone step and talked about the creek and the weather and the things that needed doing. The co-op men had resumed sitting on the step on weekday afternoons, which Pearl had not discouraged, and which gave the mill the quality of a place with people in it, which was the quality it needed most. The mill had its rhythm now. The wheel turned. The water moved through the diversion channel Theo had cut, and the wheel caught it, and the gearing moved and the stone turned, not grinding grain. There was no grain to grind, no customers waiting, no reason for flour but turning. Making the sound that Pearl had felt through the floor as a girl, the vibration that came up through the stone and through the wood and into the bones of anyone standing in the building. People came, not in crowds. In the way people come to a place that has meaning in a county, one or two at a time, on a weekday afternoon, driving out the clay road to see if the wheel was really turning the way they'd heard from someone at the co-op. Ella came most often. Gerald's wife, who had been driving by on Thursdays since Gerald died. She started coming inside, and then she started staying for coffee, and then she started bringing things, a pie dish she thought Pearl could use, a box of mason jars from her basement, the curtain rod that had been sitting in Ella's garage since she'd replaced the curtains in 2019 and had never found a reason to get rid of. "I don't know why I'm bringing you curtain rods," Ella said one afternoon. "I need curtain rods," Pearl said. "I've been using dish towels." Ella looked at the dish towels over the upper floor windows. "Cora did that too," she said. Pearl asked about Gerald. Ella talked about him for an hour, not grief talking, though there was grief in it. The practical, warm, specific kind of talking that happens when someone has been carrying a person inside them for a long time and finds the right listener. Pearl listened. She thought about the recipe book, about the entry for Gerald, rye loaf. He never asks for anything, and that's how you know. She thought about what it meant to pay attention to people who didn't ask, what it required, the patience of it, the consistency. She was learning it. She was slower than Cora had been. She was more uncertain at the door, more likely to second-guess whether a thing was wanted or intrusive. But she was learning. Theo was helping, not intentionally, but living in proximity to a 16-year-old who was learning to ask for things slowly, carefully, with the hard-won deliberateness of someone for whom asking had historically not gone well, was teaching Pearl something about the difference between need and request. Most people needed things they hadn't asked for. Most people wouldn't ask until they trusted you not to make it into something. You built that trust by showing up, by leaving bread on the step, by folding the cloth neatly and not mentioning it. On a Saturday in January, Theo came into the main floor where Pearl was reorganizing the shelving and said, without preamble, "I want to learn how to bake." Pearl looked at him. "Tuesday," she said, 7 in the morning. He was there at 6:45. They worked through the sourdough starter and the mixing and the proofing and the shaping, and the bread they baked that morning was better than anything Pearl had made alone, partly because of Theo's attention to the process, and partly because baking bread with someone was different from baking it alone in ways she hadn't anticipated. The following Tuesday, without discussion, he came back. In February, Pearl got a letter. Harlan's return address. She opened it at the work table with the mill wheel audible through the floor, the low, rhythmic turning of water and wood. He said he was sorry. He said he had been looking at himself honestly for the first time in a while and did not like what he was seeing. He said he understood now what Cora had done for him and that he had repaid it badly. He said he had, the previous Tuesday, left a loaf of bread on his neighbor's porch. A woman who lived alone and whose driveway he'd noticed was unplowed after the January snow. He said he didn't know why he was telling Pearl this. Maybe because she was the only person who would understand. Pearl read the letter twice. She wrote back the same day. She told him about Theo and the mill wheel and the recipe book. She told him she was keeping Cora's Tuesday bread going, more or less, and that it was harder than it looked and also easier than she'd expected. She told him that Cora had loved him. She told him she thought Cora would be glad to know he'd left a loaf on his neighbor's porch. She did not know what to make of him yet. She thought she might not know for a long time. There was the hearing and the forged document and the letter his attorney had sent, and those things were real and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But there was also the recipe book, and what was on page 47, and the 52 Thursday entries, and all of that was real too. People were not simple. Cora had known that. Cora had baked for Harlan for 2 years knowing exactly who he was, and she had done it anyway because some things you just do and the character of the person you do them for is not the point. Pearl had not arrived at that yet, but she thought she understood the direction of it. She did not invite him to visit, but she left the door open because that was the family habit. The flour was gone. The mill still turned. In April, when the sycamores were putting out their first leaves, and the creek ran fast with snowmelt from the Ozark ridges, Pearl stood in the upper floor of the Dutton mill and looked out at the water and the pale new green of the trees. She was 70 years old. Thea called up from the ground floor that the diversion gate was open, and did she want to come down, and she was already moving toward the stairs. She had buried her sister and driven 4 hours and opened a door that had been waiting for her. She had found a deed and a recipe book and a letter that said, "I found you," and she had understood, reading it, that being found and being known were the same thing, and that her sister had been doing this her whole life, finding people and knowing them and leaving bread on their porches without making it into anything. The chipped blue stripe mug was on the shelf. The seed catalog was open to page 41. The ball of baker's twine, rewound, sat where Cora had left it. The note gone now, but the twine still there, still the color of red and white, still the thing you reach for when you needed to tie something closed or open. The recipe book had 48 pages of Cora's entries and 6 pages now of Pearl's, and it was going to need a second volume before long. Thea called up from the ground floor that the diversion gate was open and the wheel was turning, and did she want to come down? She did. The flour was gone. The mill still turned. Some gifts don't show up until you need them.